Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kayla Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on our leaders. Today we'll be covering two very exciting individuals. I believe they've all been quite exciting, but I think these would be two particularly exciting ones. Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, and Sergio Mattarella, the President of Italy. I want to start it off with this brief quote. I like to do this sometimes just to get myself into the mood. So this is a quote by Oscar Wilde. It goes as follows: "Be yourself, everyone else is taken." I heard this one of the first days I was ever at one of the earlier offices I was working at, and one of the most intimidating guys on the whole floor comes up to me, really bald at that time. I made me a bit nervous, but he said this to me: "Be yourself, everyone else is taken." And I think it's quite explicit in its own sense, so you can think about that throughout. And I think that is a common theme between these two individuals. They kind of went their own path, and if you try continuously following in someone else's path, that's an absolute that you'll never achieve. But if you go your own path, then you'll always have achieved it. So, without further ado, we'll start off with Emmanuel Macron of France. So, Emmanuel Jean-Michel Frederick Macron was born on the 21st of September 1977. He's still alive and present, evidently so, as president. That makes him actually one of the youngest world leaders of the present world today. He's actually the youngest president in French history. We'll see that actually Napoleon was emperor actually at a younger age, but nonetheless, as a president, he is the youngest. He's a French politician, and he's also another title that goes along with the French president is co-prince of Andorra. So the president of France also claims that title as well. And he came into the role on the 14th of May 2017 at 39 years old, and he is now 42 years old in 2020, or about to be 43. He was born in Amiens, which is the capital of Somme, which is a department in Hauts-de-France, or Hauts-de-France, which is like high northern France. The town is known for a cathedral. It's one of the tallest classic Gothic churches of the 13th century. So it's an old relic to have in one's hometown, but I think it does yield one who's fascinated in history, and I think he was really one who was fascinated in history. He often quotes Greek and Roman history, the classics, and even Napoleon as well as a more close parallel. It's also the home of the author Jules Verne, so also I think that's where he gets a little bit of his creative love. He's a big piano player as well. It's about 62 miles southwest of Lille and about 75 miles north of Paris, so not too far, and I bet he obviously visited both of these towns and traveled around France quite a bit while growing up. Yeah, it's got a population of 136,105 people as of 2006, so on the smaller side, definitely smaller than Paris, but it's definitely sufficient to have all the resources that a young leader like himself would have needed. It was fought over during both world wars, so obviously I think during, at least in growing up, he was very familiar with the history of World War I and World War II, which I think is very key for any world leader. His mother, Francois Macron, or maiden name being Noguez, was a physician. And his father, Jean-Michel Macron, was a professor of neurology at the University of Picardy, which is in Amiens and has one of the largest hospitals in France. And they actually divorced really quite recently in 2010, almost just before, 7 years before he became president. So I think that's interesting that his parents divorced so late. Obviously, he was a younger leader, but that obviously did probably affect his psychological state while he was entering into political life. His parents divorced, and as we'll see, he has a very unusual romantic life himself. He has a younger brother, about 2 years younger, named Laurent, and a sister 5 years younger, or Laurent is the sister, pardon me. And so that makes him the eldest child, but the parents actually had an older child who was born as a stillborn. So I guess there was additional pressure on him to be at least successful or sufficient. And both of his parents coming from a more technical background in the sciences or in healthcare, I think they really demanded academic excellence of him, as we'll see he does. The Macrons from Arthy in Hauts-de-France, which is High France, but the paternal grandfather, George William Robertson, actually is from English descent, so from Bristol. So he does have a little bit of British blood in him, but in all intents and purposes, I think he considers himself to be very French, and everyone would likely consider him to be very French. The Nogas, the family of his mother, were from Gascony near the Pyrenees, which are south, closer to Italy actually. The Pyrenees Mountains pretty much border Italy and France. It's actually a very nice drive between the two countries. His love for reading came from his left-leaning grandmother, who he called Manette. Her actual name was Germaine. She came from a modest upbringing and ultimately climbed to become the principal of a school. So I think it was someone he really admired. For parallel to me, I really admired my paternal grandmother, and obviously my maternal one as well. But she's still alive. But my paternal grandmother died when I was pretty young, and she really got me I think a certain competitiveness. We would always play cards together, and that really inspired me. So nonetheless, his love for learning, but also love for left-wing politics, came from his grandmother, Manette, he called her. He was raised in a non-religious family. However, he requested himself to be baptized at 12 years old. I think a common theme throughout his whole life is that he always wanted to become, more French and become more aligned with the voting population. France does have a pretty big Catholic population, so he thought it would be a good idea to do that, and evidently he did so. And very much very true to himself, he never really takes no for an answer. His parents were relatively atheistic or agnostic, and he went out of his way and did it himself. So, and also, I guess not to delve too much onto this, but having parents more in the science field tend to be more agnostic or even atheistic. So it probably was a bit of a surprise that the youngest son went on to get himself baptized. He was educated mainly at the Jesuit Lycée La Providence, but his parents actually sent him away in his final year after he started a romantic bond with Brigitte Auzière, who he later would marry. Brigitte Auzière was his teacher, and she actually had 3 children at this time, and when they started falling in love, and he would later marry her once he became older. I think a parallel to this is Napoleon and Josephine. Napoleon was quite a bit younger than Josephine at the time, 6 years older, so even the gap was smaller, but nonetheless, I'll talk about that more in his personal life, but I think it's important to note that this is the type of individual who, obviously I think the love was mutual, but for a man to date someone that much older, their own teacher in high school, I think he met her first when he was 14 years old in a drama class. I think that's really something to be said about someone who is at least very mature, if not very, very ambitious. He graduated from the elite Lycée Henri IV with mention très bien, which is grades between 16 to 20, French grading scales between 16 to 20. I did an exchange semester, and that was a très bien category. The bien category is 14 to 15.9. Assez bien is 12 to 13.9. And then, it goes down from there. But nonetheless, he graduated in the top bucket of in the grading system, and from a very elite high school. He was nominated for Concours Général, which is the most selective high school level competition for French literature. So perhaps maybe growing up in a place close to Jules Verne, or just perhaps from his own artistic temperament, he was interested in French literature. I think also he just notably has a love for all things French. He received a diploma for piano studies as well in Amiens Conservatory, so once again, just elucidating that I do think he has quite an artistic bent. He failed to gain entry into École Normale Supérieure in France twice, so I think that at the time was considered probably the top university in France, but it's debatable. It's actually quite a complex educational system, but nonetheless, the point here is that people who don't get into their top university or their top job doesn't mean they're instantly prevented from achieving their dreams or aspirations. So, just a little bit of background about the university system in France. I consider Sorbonne the best for the liberal arts. There's also University Paris 2, Panthéon Assay, which is the University of Paris split, and the legal faculty went to Paris 2, and the more liberal arts stayed at Paris 1, so that's also great. There's also HEC and ESSEC, which are more specialized schools for particularly business. And all of these are Grand École, so they're all many, many good schools. But nonetheless, he attended instead Paris Ouest Nanterre, which is in La Défense, which is the financial district to the west in France, and it's also considered Paris 10. And it was yeah, he studied philosophy and received a DEA, which is a master's degree, for his thesis on Machiavelli and Hegel. Machiavelli I actually cover in a previous video. I really recommend you watch that. In fact, I even recommend you read The Prince. I think obviously there's some good things in it. There's a lot of greed in it too, which is obviously bad, but particularly read the discourses at the end. But I think it's a really great entrance into political philosophy, and it's an exciting read. I think a lot of people who have read it too would love to speak with you about it as well. So he studied Machiavelli and Hegel, who I didn't cover, but is a German idealist and contributor to the analytical political science, just like Machiavelli. Machiavelli was considered one of the first actual political scientists, where they put it into really quantitative and concrete terms. And Hegel was similar, but from Germany. In 1999, he worked for French Protestant philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who was whose last major work was Le Mémoire, l'Histoire, l'Oubli, which was but Macron was mostly working on the notes and bibliography, and it was written about largely religious agnosticism, which is actually interesting considering he got himself baptized, but nonetheless he got associated with some pretty powerful philosophical leaders very young and just out of university. He became a member of the editorial board for Paris Bourse Literary and current events magazine Esprit, very famous magazine. If you ever go to Paris, you'll see it's quite still frequently circulated. People don't read magazines as much anymore, but I'm sure they still have a digital platform. But nonetheless, I think this proves that not only did he have the intellectual curiosity to take in, at this point he also had the capacity to express himself as well. So I think that's probably the two main skills that the Plato's philosophical leader must have. They must be intellectually curious to take it in, but they also must have the capacity to share it. Being born in 1977, he was actually the last year of French children who had mandatory national service, so they had to join the army or Navy or whatnot. But he actually avoided this obligation because he was a graduate student. So some people, maybe some really strong conservatives, would criticize him, saying, Macron, you should have done your service. Technically, you were in 1977, you're the last year, but he was a graduate student. I don't think there was any substantial patriotic need for him to go to war, and I think he was very focused on his study. I don't think he did it because he was a coward, I guess would be the worst thing you can call him, but I don't think that's why he did it. And I don't think, as we'll see, I don't think he is a coward at all. He later received a master's degree in public affairs at Sciences Po, which is very, very famous. I should have mentioned that earlier. It's also Grande École, but it's more political science focused. Another famous alumni from there would be Pierre-Éliott Trudeau from Canada. So a very interesting school that's always been on my radar. And he majored in public guidance and economy. I think it's clear through this through Macron's life that obviously he was very ambitious and was interested in politics from a very early life in philosophy, and I think he just needed to get the education to sort of prove himself to be worthy in the French system, because the French system is very still to this day very elite, even post the French Revolution. After that, he retained training for senior civil service career at the prestigious École Nationale d'Administration, ENA. He trained at the embassy in Nigeria and at the office in Was, northern France, and he graduated in 2004 at 26 years old. So the ENA is like a special school for preparing diplomats, and I know he had probably had many opportunities to travel, but to work at the embassy in Nigeria, I think would be a very, very great experience for someone younger than 26 years old, and obviously really an opportunity to learn more about the world. In terms of his career, after ENA, he began to work as Inspection Générale des Finances, which is a branch of the Ministry of Finance, and he was mentored by the head of the IGF, Inspection Générale des Finances, Jean-Pierre Jouyet, who would later become the ambassador to the UK, but it was also, as we'll see, a very important mentor in his life. As inspector of finances during the summer, he gave lectures at Prep ENA, an elite private school geared towards Grande École like HEC and Sciences Po. So I think this is interesting to note that even though he was, in his undergrad, he wasn't actually too successful at getting his top school, he still, even at a young age, had felt like giving back and helping younger students also climb in the academic ladder. As sad as it is, the French system, or for better or for worse, it is obviously, if it's based on merit, then it's a good thing. If it's based on elitism, then it's bad. But I think he's obviously trying to help people, but he's trying to help those who are already elite get into elite schools. Might be considered an elitist thing, but nonetheless, maybe he was just doing it for the extra pocket money, who knows. But I think he was paid sufficiently, but I think he also just wanted to, have an opportunity to help some young people. In 2006, Lawrence Parisset offered a job as managing director for the Mouvement des Entreprises de France, which was the largest employer federation in France, which is like anti-union, and he declined as for various reasons. So like it was an employer federation, so that is like a union of employers. So that's like obviously not. I want to use that's if two large corporations team up against the workers. I think is very bad. Like unions obviously do have a purpose. We do need some capitalism, but I think that would have been a very, very poor choice for Macron. And given Macron's left-leaning bent that he got from his grandmother, he evidently refused that position. In 2007, at 29 years old, from 30 years old, he was appointed deputy rapporteur for Jacques Attali's commission to unleash French growth, which was in 2008, which paid but instead he paid him $50,000 to buy himself out of his government contract, and instead became an investment banker for Rothschild & Co. in the 17th arrondissement. Rothschild & Co. For a little bit of, I don't want to talk too much about investment banking. I have some experience working at Credit Suisse in investment banking. I actually interviewed for Rothschild & Co. for the private equity division. They call it the merchant banking, private equity, 5 arrows, principal investments. But nonetheless, it's I don't think that he's like getting some secret Illuminati financing. Rothschild today is just a normal corporation. I think one of the leaders is still a Rothschild, but the Rothschilds have diversified their money so much. There are so many Rothschilds. Like you'll find a Rothschild in New York who is not wealthy at all. So some are still wealthy, but he's not. Like I don't think you should subscribe to this conspiracy that Macron was financed by the Rothschild family and is part of some Illuminati conspiracy. If you want to, you're entitled to your opinion, but I think it was just a job to make some money. So he started in March 2020. He returned to Attali's commission as a member, and he left his job as Inspector des Finances after his election of Nicolas Sarkozy as president. So he actually did not really like Sarkozy, and therefore he was appointed managing director in his first year at Rothschild. So managing director, not to talk too much about it, goes analyst, associate, VP, director, managing director. So very high position right out of the gates. He was still very young. Macron always seems to at least hit above his age belt and go straight to becoming a managing director. And managing directors, so the hours in investment banking are crazy, but managing directors are more like deal makers, more social people. So maybe it was just his skill set was really aligned for that. One of his first transactions was a €9 billion deal with Nestle's acquisition of one of Pfizer's largest subsidiaries, based around baby drinks. This and other deals ultimately made him a millionaire. So spent his whole life, in the public sector, and then jumps into the private sector just for a very short period and makes $1 million or $1 million plus. It's said that he probably achieved $3 million over the from 2009 to 2013. He even left in 2012 at 35 years old. So, Macron is sufficiently wealthy, we can call him, even besides his public salary. terms of his political career, he spent 2 years in his youth working for the Citizen and Republican movement, but never applied to become a member. It's kind of a republicanism-based party based on sovereignism, but also Euroscepticism and democratic socialism and even protectionism. So I think these are all policies that don't really align with Macron. I don't think Macron does have, his fault issues with the EU, but he's not a Eurosceptic, and he is pro. He doesn't really believe too much in protectionism. He is a bit more than some perhaps of his opponents in the French government, but he's not a protectionist, I would say. So he joined. He was assistant to Mayor Georges Sacre of the 11th arrondissement of Paris, which is actually one of my favorite arrondissements. I actually really like the 10th, but it's really nice. Not to talk too much about France, but it's built like a snail, so it goes like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And 11's a little bit further out, but it's very nice. All of Paris, in my opinion, is generally quite beautiful, and for different reasons. Even the grindier parts are just as beautiful for different reasons. He joined the Socialist Party at 24 years old, but he never really did anything with it. But briefly in 2010, he renewed it, from 2006 to 2009, as we'll see later in his political life. But it's interesting, like the Socialist Party, he obviously is a more left-wing leader, and I think, as we'll see, his greatest claim to fame at this point is fending off the far right-leaning Marine Le Pen. His mentor, Jean-Pierre Jouyet from the IGF, introduced him to François Hollande, who would later become president in 2006, and he joined François Hollande's staff in 2010. In 2007, he attempted to run for a seat in the National Assembly in Picardie, Hauts-de-France, so closer to his region in Amiens, under the Socialist Party's label. That's after he renewed the Socialist Party's label, but under the same party as Hollande, because Hollande's from the Socialist Party, but his application was actually denied, so he failed. So like you can say a lot of things about Macron's success, but also he is entitled to his failures, and he has he's rejected from universities, he's failed to gain political roles, so life's not perfect for anyone. In 2010, he was offered a chance as Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister François Fillon, but he declined and joined Nick Hollande instead. The Republican Party was under Nicolas Sarkozy's presidency as well. But anyways, he seems to be quite more loyal to Hollande over Sarkozy or François Fillon. He was appointed Deputy Secretary General by François Hollande shortly after the election in 2012 at 34 years old, and at 34 years old became a senior advisor. So his loyalty to Hollande seemed to be paying off at this point, and he became a senior advisor to the president at 34 years old. And as I said, and I'll beat this to death, I think 30 is probably the earliest to enter politics. 34 is a great year to be pretty politically influential. In August of 2014, the Prime Minister under Hollande from the Socialist Party would later step down in 2017 and roused to support Macron. So he was appointed Cabinet Minister of the Economy, Industry, and Digital Affairs at 36 years old. So he's continuously paying respect, staying loyal to the party, and his party just seems to keep rising. I also think it's because he's a particularly great speaker, and he's young. I think a lot of these older French politicians admire his augustness. He takes on a wife much older than him. He's always just chasing, and I think they admired that in him. He's, in terms of his actual work as Minister of the Economy, Industry, and Digital Affairs, he was very business friendly. He was a reform champion as Minister of the Economy. He was helpful to win the right and he is more left leaning. Obviously, he does support unions and French jobs, but he's also very business friendly, so it makes him very nuanced, and that does help him win the right wing voters. So he's probably more economically economically he's central, but nonetheless, he is a great businessman, proven through the private sector at Rothschild. He was able and is able to garner the right-wing votes, and that's why, as we'll see, he does beat Marine Le Pen. And he completed this role in August 16 of that year. He launched a campaign for 2017 as elections presidential for presidency. He left the Socialist Party to start a center-left party, his own party, En Marche, La République En Marche, written over here. I think a kind of a strange name, like the Republic walking or marching. But nonetheless, I think he's very much a self-starter, entrepreneurial, wants to start his own party. Socialist Party, I think, was a bit too left, so he wanted to go a bit more centrist. He was a bit more pro-business than the full socialist. But he was still supported by many of the Socialist Party friends. So the worry was, are they splitting the left-wing vote by taking some of the socialist voters and dividing them into the Republic En Marche? It's hard to say. Well, as history shows, he ultimately succeeds. So this was a very important election in 2017. If you were following, it was against Marine Le Pen of the National Front. So she was the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was a former FN leader. So her father was very right-wing as well. She was quite right-wing, a little bit more democratic and Republican than her nationalist father. For example, she allows for civil unions for same-sex couples. She has accepted abortion and is withdrawing the death penalty from her platform, or had removed it from her platform. However, she's opposed to globalization. She's against the European Union and federalism, which is I'll talk about that more in the Federalist Papers, for example. And she favors loosely Confederate Europe, which is the opposite of a strong federalist Europe of nations. To talk briefly about this, I think that in the Federalist Papers, for example, by Alexander Hamilton, I think a stronger EU will prevent from wars. If they go more to a weak confederacy, eventually there will be wars between the European countries. So I think it is a necessity that the European Union at least remain as strong as possible under the Federalist ideals. I think another great book on that is by Clarence Strait, a former Rhodes Scholar who advocates for uniting not just the EU but also the United States and Canada into a stronger union and all the other countries when they become better. I just think that's the only way to prevent get peace into perpetuity. Even for example, the Amphissidians, which were in ancient Greece, which was a union between the Greek city-states based on Delphi, so they were bound by religion and they were bound by a common enemy, Xerxes. Even that union wasn't strong enough. So that's the main argument for federalism, is that the federal government needs to be strong, otherwise the peace will fight. Just like you could say the same thing that a family must be strong, otherwise the family members will fight, or a community must be strong, otherwise the neighbors will fight. I think that to be true. Abbe Milo agrees with that. That's an Alexander Hamilton philosophy, a Plutarch philosophy, very much so. This is really what I believe. But Marine Le Pen also was calling for France to leave the Eurozone. So this was also very close to the time of Brexit. And she also wanted to see a referendum for France to leave the EU. So these are pretty extreme policies. She was originally Macron was behind in the opinion polls, but eventually won with 66.1% of the votes in the second round and became president of France on May 7th of 2017. Brexit voted 52% to leave on June of 2016. So you could say that his election success was kind of the aftermath of what happened in Britain. In 2016, Brexit gets voted at 52%, and France is like, whoa, this is a reality, and then therefore said, okay, no Le Pen, let's vote for Macron. That's kind of what I think happened. If France had done the vote first, maybe they would have voted Le Pen and then voted for a referendum and left, and then Brexit might have actually, Britain might have actually stayed, the UK might have actually stayed. That's just my thoughts. I think the first one kind of maybe didn't know as much what they were dealing with, and the second kind of adopted. So nonetheless, Macron won. and he topped actually the ballots in the first round. Pardon me. His renamed the party the Republic en Marche (LREM), and in the next legislative elections following, they secured a majority in the National Assembly. So his party got quite powerful as a result of this too. And therefore, at 39 years old, he became the youngest president in French history, which is amazing to say. Napoleon actually became Emperor of France at 35, so beat him by 4 years and became Emperor, but I think you can't compare yourself with Napoleon anyways. But Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister of Canada at 43 years old in 2015, which was considered very young at the time. But, he's 4 years older than Macron when Macron got in, so good on Macron. In terms of his presidency, he's been, in terms of labor unions, he intends to switch to a more flexible unions like that in Germany and Scandinavia. He hopes to decrease unemployment by 7% by capping the cost of unfair dismissal, and reforms taxes and benefits to make low-wage employees more attractive. So he's making the unions less powerful in the hopes that the private sector will hire more people. It's a risk because you're obviously might be hurting the job security of those employees, or putting them in more risky working conditions. But nonetheless, he thinks that his main objective is to target unemployment, and hopefully working conditions might follow as the economy spurs itself up. He pledged to crack down on French campaigns buying cheap labor in Eastern Europe, which he considers to be social dumping. So obviously he is a globalist, he is pro-Europe, but he is a bit protectionist in terms of labor, and I don't think most leaders are similar in that sense. They want to retain the jobs for their people when possible. In terms of migration, he has recently changed to tightening in 2018 versus 2015. Don't want to go too much in the quotes here, but I'll get this one off because it's not as revealing. The reality is that Europe is not experiencing a migration crisis of the same magnitude as the one it experienced in 2015. We must take back control. So I think the reason why I say that is, firstly, obviously he is pro-Europe, but he is sort of getting a little bit more anti-immigration. But it's also important to note that all these leaders, at least Macron, can be nuanced. He can change his opinion, and I think that is a good idea, but I don't think he changed it in the right direction. He planned to give his wife an official role within the government but 290,000 people signed on Change.com that he shouldn't hire his wife, so he abandoned the plan. So that was, it is a conflict of interest to hire your wife, but perhaps she might have actually been eligible for the role. So, if that be the case, then maybe not. But in France, they're a little bit more strict with that. In terms of civil rights, he rejected nationalist wishes to make the Corsican an official language of France on a visit to Corsica in 2018. So this is interesting because I do think he has a love for Napoleon, but he did not grant Corsican language as an official language of France. I think, once again, that's a bit more, not nationalistic, but maybe patriotic for the French language. And obviously it would hurt for the Corsican peoples to sort of be rejected in this sense. But he did offer to recognize Corsica in the French Constitution, which is good. He proposed to recognize the Islamic religion in France with respect to laïcité, secularist principles of France, and he opposed banning Muslim headscarves at universities. So I think that was a nice liberal idea. Here's the quote here. We are working on the structuring of Islam in France. My goal is to rediscover what lies at the heart of laïcité, the possibility of being able to believe as not to believe. So he believes that, people have a right to religion and a right to believe in Islam. The only thing is that France does ascribe to secularist principles. They would say the same thing, that Catholicism should not be involved in the government or directly involved in the educational system too much. So there is a barrier, but it should apply to all religions, which I think is fair. And I think allowing women to wear headscarves and such, or opposing the ban against headscarves in universities, was obviously a good thing, especially considering he could have, a lot of people did not agree with him, and he took a good, positive stance in this respect. In terms of his foreign policy, France's colonization was a crime against humanity, so he actually claims that some of the things that France had done previously had been really wrong. And similarly, its military intervention was a historic error, so he's actually, despite his love for history, he's actually gone back and criticized a lot of France's past actions, particularly with respect to colonization. In January 2017, he said we need more balanced talks with Syria, including talks with Bashar al-Assad. However, in April of 2017, which was very significant, even particularly for me as a news story, when Bashar al-Assad was supposedly criticized of using attack on Khan Sheikhoun as proposed chemical attacks. And he said, and I hold the same stance, if there was a use of chemicals during this presidency, France should act unilaterally to punish al-Assad. Whatever the reasons, a government should never use chemical weapons on their citizens. Like, no matter what the citizens do, that's just, yeah. But the debate is that maybe he didn't actually do it and someone else did it. I just think in that region, the government is the most likely perpetrator. But nonetheless, no unilateral action has yet been done. He has considered Hollande's Israel policy, and he opposes the boycott, divestment, and sanctions (BDS) movement. So he was a little bit more pro-Israel than some of our other leaders, and perhaps than I might even agree. But he refused to state a position on the recognition of the state of Palestine as well. I think, many countries, the United States does not recognize the state of Palestine, but the EU does. I think, I've been to Palestine, I do think that they deserve to have their state recognized, even if they don't get Jerusalem. I think Jerusalem should be shared as a mutual holy site, but to deny them the West Bank or Gaza, I think is quite unfair and a bit of a double standard. So I'm surprised that Macron would say that, but if he were to visit, I think he would say that they should. The debate is not whether they should have land or not land, it's how much land, and then you can have a serious discussion. But to not recognize their state at all, I think is too binary and too cruel. In May 2018, he condemned the Israeli armed forces for violence against the Palestinians in Gaza, so step in the right direction. So he says the Palestinians can have no recognition of land, but don't attack them. So, okay, definitely don't attack them, but it would be nice if they had some land, to call their own, or that was recognized by France and the United States. He criticized Franco-Swiss construction firm Lafarge-Holcim for competing for Mexico-U.S. border wall with Trump. So he's not pro the wall between the United States and Mexico, and he does not support French companies supporting that either. He condemned the treatment of the Rohingya government's Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and he considers that to be genocide. I do agree with that, and it's a form of ethnic purification. I think a lot of Muslims are generally very poorly persecuted around the world, and he does hold this stance as well. In terms of the EU, he says it's too reliant on NATO or the US, and he wants to improve relations with Russia. So that's an interesting one. He wants the EU to move more east in terms of its relationship. In November 2019, the Bloc EU extension talks with Albania and Northern Macedonia, he proposed changes to their enlargement policy. So despite his pro-European policies, he's a bit more conservative in who he would allow enter the EU. So he's hesitant in inviting Albania and Northern Macedonia into the European Union. In terms of his personal life, he's married to Brigitte Trogneux, and he was 24 years older, as mentioned earlier, so quite a lot older. And she still works as a teacher in the same high school where they met. They met in a theater workshop when he was 15 and she was 39. So can you imagine when you were 15 years old, one of your classmates started a relationship with their 39-year-old theater teacher. That's wild to me. But they did not become a couple until 3 years later, 18 years when he was 18 years old. But that would also make her 42 years old, so double his age, which is interesting though. That doesn't discount that it's love. They married in 2007, so he was also patient with it as well. She has 3 children from her previous marriage, but he has none of his own. So I think that's very interesting. I always mention that Modi has no children, Shinzo Abe has no children. Maybe it's because these people are so busy, maybe they're so stressed, or maybe they just don't have no interest of children at all. Maybe they see all the people of their country as children, and it would be an insult to their people to have children. But it's hard to say, but I always do think it is on the sadder side. I hope to have children, and I think that's unfortunate. But he does have 3 adopted children from her previous marriage. Apparently, they also have a very great, because she was his theater teacher, so she actually helped him in terms of his public speaking in the 2017 elections. So she definitely does help him. Still kind of his teacher, which is a very strange relationship that I haven't seen a parallel almost anywhere else. He's been a pianist since his youth, playing the piano. He enjoys Schumann and Liszt. He also skis, plays tennis, and boxes. Justin Trudeau boxes. I wonder if they would ever box. That would be funny to see. A friendly boxing match. He speaks fluent English because he went to integrated education growing up. He adopted a black Labrador Retriever named Griffin, or Griffin Dog, on August of 2017 during his election campaign. So I guess maybe he just loves dogs, or maybe he thought it would be a good political move. Could go either way. In June of 2018, prior to meeting with Pope Francis, he declared himself an agnostic Catholic. So when he was younger, he really, really wanted to be more Catholic, probably more aligning himself with French. But finally, when he went to go and meet the Pope, he said he's Catholic, but he's a bit more agnostic, and that in the sense that he's respecting other religions too, like Islam, for example, or other sects of Christianity and Judaism as well. As we've seen that his actual Israel policy is actually more pro Judaism over Islam, at least with respect to the Palestine-Israel relationship. But he was made an honorary canon of St. John Lanterne at the Cathedral of Rome too, so the Pope was not too upset with that statement. He's a fan of the Association Football Olympique de Marseille, which is interesting because he never grew up in Marseille. Marseille is actually far down in the south, so it's surprising that he got into that football team. During the 2018 World Cup, I was actually in France. I wasn't there for the finals, but I was there for the semifinals. But in the semifinals with King Philip, he sat with King Philip and Queen Mathilde, and he was known for cheering a lot. But more importantly, in the World Cup final, he got very famous for his enthusiastically cheering with the Croatian president Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović. And it was kind of considered a parody. He was outstanding cheering, and it was just a fun thing to see. I think the sports are actually good for diffusing violence because they're not for example, sports. Well, the World Cup's a bit different because then it starts getting nationalistic. But domestic sports it's nice because it's not city versus city. The players are from random places, all over, so it diffuses violence. It gives something for people to cheer about that doesn't actually would very unlikely cause a war. So I think it's nice. Okay, move into the quotes. We'll go the quotes. The Macron. Well, actually, let's talk about the country. So population 66.99 million. That's about double the size of Canada in terms of population. About double the size of California in terms of population, and about double the size of Tokyo in terms of population. So in terms of GDP, 2.778 trillion. That's very, very large. Easily puts it in the top 10. I think it's maybe number 5, number 4. In terms of area, 643,801 kilometers squared. So it actually is a very big country. The capital, as you might guess, is Paris. Some quotes. This one is more quantitative, but I just wanted to have it down on paper. Macron law is to restore 6 billion euros of purchasing power to the French Republic by a 0.3% increase in GDP over 5 years and a 0.4% increase over 10. I just wanted to mention this because he's very sophisticated in finance, but also it's very very conservative. 0.3% or 0.4% over 10 years. Obviously, the GDP is already very large, but it's not that big of an ask. So I think he's very practical. Francois Hollande doesn't believe in Jupiterian presidency. He thinks the president is just another message sender in the media political landscape. So this I don't want to discount. He did have a really great relationship with Hollande, but the way he sees presidency is Jupiter was very, very powerful Roman god, and he's kind of juxtaposing Jupiter with Hermes, or the sun god. So he says that a leader should not be just a messenger, but a leader should be a powerful individual. So that's what he's getting at here, sort of criticizing his past mentor, but nonetheless, I think that's more of what we're going to see of him. I know it's hard for him not to be inspired by Napoleon and want to be a man of action rather than a messenger. Nationalism is the exact opposite of patriotism. I would say the exact opposite of nationalism is internationalism or globalization, but nonetheless, I agree with his point in that nationalism is bad. I think most of the heinous crimes in recent history have come out of nationalism, but what he's saying is patriotism can be a good thing. It's good to be patriotic about France, and you don't have to go so far as to be nationalistic and try to wipe out all the other countries or cut them off. I already went through that one, and we went through that one as well. In terms of the pictures, top right is the picture of his the flag of Amiens, which is where he grew up. Down below, Paris Nanterre, where he went to University of Paris Nanterre, where he studied. Sciences Po, where he studied as well. Many other famous, lots of my friends are there as well. ENA, which is particularly for preparing political leaders. That's where he also attended, more of a professional school. Rothschild & Co., the investment bank, but I call it an investment bank, but it's not just an investment bank. They've got many other different. They got wealth management, private equity, but he was in the investment banking practice. La République En Marche, that's the party that he created. Down here is a symbol. I often like to have a symbol of the president, but this is just the liberty, fraternity, égalité, which is like the sort of like, they came from the revolution, very important words for France. And in the bottom is Droit au but, which is actually the Marseille football team that he likes. So just to get a little bit of fun information about him. So that is Macron. We'll talk about him briefly in the comparison. Next we'll move to Sergio Mattarella. This one is also very, very profound leader. So Sergio Mattarella was born on July 23rd, 1941, so quite a bit older than Macron. He is an Italian politician, jurist, academic, lawyer, and he's serving as the 12th and current president of Italy since February of 2015. In terms of his early life, he was born in Palermo, which is the capital of Sicily. So Sicily is one of the 5 autonomous regions and the largest of Italy and the largest island in the Mediterranean. So 2 interesting facts. And so Sicily is largely autonomously sort of self-governing, and it's also the birthplace of the mafia, which, if you ever see, I think it's the Godfather Part 2, they go back and check out, they go to Palermo and become made men and stuff, so it's very much glorified, I think, in a lot of culture, but you'll see it's obviously a very bad thing. And I think Mattarella, if not for being significant as a president, his contribution to putting a stop to the mafia in Palermo and Sicily is very honorable. It's 2,700-year-old city, Palermo. Was founded in 734 BC by the Phoenicians as Ziz, and which was also part of Carthage as well. The Greek colonies called it Panormos, which means all port, and so Palermo comes from Panormos, which means all port. So it's a very big port city, obviously on the island, but it's also, besides being known for the mafia, it's also known for gastronomy. Sicilian food is very famous, and it's also known for the arts as well. So it's had its fair share of hard times, but maybe in some of the harshest places, that's where the art can flourish the most. But yeah, he comes from a prominent Sicilian family. His father, Bernardo Mattarella, was an anti-fascist and co-founded the Christian Democracy political party. So that's very significant because he would come to work for the Christian Democratic Party, but also being an anti-fascist, which is just coming after Mussolini, who was a fascist ally to Adolf Hitler. And I think his father is a very respectable and important individual. The Christian Democratic Party dominated the Italian political scene for almost 50 years, as well as his father, and his father was also minister several times. So very significant family. So we'll see how this contrasts Macron. Macron kind of came from a little bit of obscurity in terms of his family. They were obviously like intellectuals, like the science type. Mattarella comes from a family of politics. His mother, Maria Bucceletto, came from an upper middle class family in Trapani, Sicily. So his mother was not quite as famous as his father, so that must have been, I guess, refreshing. Not two families merging to create one super family. It's like a powerful individual marrying someone who, for love, I would say. Yeah. He moved to Rome in his youth for his father's work, because his father, Rome is the capital of Italy, and if he's working for the Christian Democratic Party, maybe as a minister, he had to work there. And during this time, he joined the Catholic Action, which is a Catholic lay association, and he eventually would become regional chairman for the Lazio region in 1961 to 1964, from 20 to 23 years old. So as we'll see, did he want to join this Catholic lay association because he was very religious, or did he just want to get some political involvement? Because Rome, even the educational system, unlike France, where it's very separate, the educational system and the governance system is very closely tied to religion, because the Vatican's right there and has its own government as well. He attended the classical Lyceum San Leone Magno in Rome, which is some of the oldest schools in all of Italy, and perhaps even in the old world. But it must be noted that they are not secularist, so it is very Catholic. It is a religious-based school. Following his high school, he went to study at Sapienza University of Rome, which is it's probably there are many great universities in Italy, but it's probably one of the most significant in Rome. Two of the top universities actually happen to be in Pisa. Also, University of Bologna is good, and for specific industries, like as I said, HEC or ESSEC in France, there's Bocconi in Italy, which is a great business school as well. So, but nonetheless, for law, I think Sapienza is very significant, and if you wanted to stay in the capital and in Rome, I think it was a very, very good decision. He graduated in 1964 with merit for his thesis, The Function of Political Direction, at 23 years old. So spent a decent amount of time in the educational system up until 23, and very much like Macron, he liked political writing and political philosophizing. In 1967, at 26 years old, he became a lawyer in administrative law in Palermo, so it goes back to his hometown in Sicily. And in 1969 to 1983, he taught parliamentary procedure at the University of Palermo. So sort of was going down an academic route. And besides his involvement with the Catholic lay agency, I do believe he was very much more focused on an academic career at this point. He had a focus on constitutional law topics, and as well as the intervention of the Sicilian region in the economy, bicameralism, which is the two-house system, upper house, lower house, the elected and Senate, for example, and evolution of the Sicilian regional administration and controls on local authorities. So kind of dealing with the autonomy of Sicily and the broader picture of Italy as a whole, but also in terms of the constitutional manners, so which is also important, as we'll see. He eventually goes on to become a judge of this constitutional court. In 1966, he married Marisa Chiazes, who was the daughter of Laurel Chiazes, who was actually the former head and rector of the University of Palermo. And they had 3 children, Laura, Francesco, and Bernardo. So while he was working as a professor, he starts marrying the dean's daughter, which is pretty significant. So either he was just, very romantic. I don't, yeah. It sounds very romantic to me. In 1980, at 38 years old, so he spends a lot of time just doing academics, settling down, having children with his wife. At 38 years old, his older brother, Piersanti Mattarella, who was part of the Christian Democrat Party, the party of his father, was president of Sicily, was since 1978 for 2 years was killed by the Sicilian mafia in Palermo. So this was, I would say, the trigger, the catalyst that got Mattarella interested in politics. His father was in politics, his brother was in politics, and suddenly his brother gets killed by the mafia. So he's like, okay, he can't stay in the academic world or just not get involved after seeing his older brother die, which I think is one of the most, of all the lives we've covered here, one of the most profound catalysts for entering into politics. Death of an older brother is up there, yeah. And also seeing that his father had dedicated his life to that too, I think he now felt, okay, now it's his turn to really step in. So he began his parliamentary career. He began in 1983 at 42 years old, so quite a bit older. Especially considering Macron. Macron was already president by 39 years old, so he didn't even enter until 42 years old. He was elected to the Chamber of Deputies in the left-leaning faction of the Christian Democratic Party that supported the historic compromise with the Italian Communist Party. So it's really more left-leaning allies. He chose the left part of the Christian Democratic Party and allied more with the more left-leaning parties, that being the Italian Communist Party. In 1984, he was tasked by the Secretary of the Christian Democrats to clean up the made men. So in the mafia, one becomes a made man once the older made man sort of picks them, basically, who had a strong presence in the Sicilian faction of the ex-Salvo Lima and, for example, Salvo Lima and Vito Ciancimono. So there was really these made man mafia guys who were actually involved in the government. So the secretary of the party tells Mattarella to go and get rid of him. So imagine how terrifying that would be after his brother got killed, to be responsible for essentially getting the perpetrators. He helped at this time a young lawyer and friend of his brother become mayor of Palermo as well, which partly facilitated it. Putting a group of people in power was really a key aspect of his success. In 1987, he becomes Minister for Parliamentary Relations, and he serves that until 1989. In 1989 to 1999, he became Minister of Public Relations, so just moving more on the federal side, less after his success in cleaning up the mafia in Sicily. In 1998 to 1999, at 57 years old, he became Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, so a bit on the older side, but he also waited a long time until he really got that trigger, so very, very different from Macron. In 2011, however, though, he was elected judge to the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in Italy, like the Supreme Court of Italy, which I think his background in constitutionalism, through his studies as a professor, I think is very fitting. But also, I think it's also dangerous for one to move between the executive and judicial branches. I think there's a conflict of interest, especially as a judge. You need to be impartial and not have political motivations on your mind. But nonetheless, I think he was a great fit for the job anyways. In 2015, at 74 years old, he became president of Italy. So 74 years old is quite old to first become president. He's 79 years old today. Pope Francis is 83 years old, but being the Pope is an older profession by nature. Queen Elizabeth is 94 years old, but that's a monarch. The president of Cameroon is 87 years old, so that's the oldest elected individual I could find. Well, you could say Pope Francis is elected too. It's 87 years old. But nonetheless, he won 665 out of 1,009 votes, and the Democratic Party, the New Center-Right Party, the Civic Choice, the Union of Center and Left Ecology Freedom all really supported his party as well. So he's really just a loved guy. He's older, but I think he has a good heart. He's seen a lot of tragedy, and he's really fought against oppression and evil, mainly the mafia. And I can definitely see why people would very much support him. And nepotism beside his father being the former leader of the Christian Democratic Party obviously helped a bit. He replaced Giorgio Napolitano, who was actually the longest serving president at the time, for 9 years. So obviously for such a substantial change, like the longest serving president to step down for a new leader, they had to be a very, very inspiring and good leader. And evidently, I think Sergio Mattarella is exactly that. His first statement was that my thoughts go first and especially to the difficulties and hopes of our fellow citizens. So I think it's just, I have that on the slide here. I think that's like a simple thing, but I think it's true. And I think he's a very, very honest person. Like, for example, if he wanted to join the mafia, I think there would have been plenty of opportunities to do so. I bet he would have been, they would have loved to have had him. His first presidential visit was to Fosse Adriantine, which was formerly a Nazi-occupied area, where 335 individuals were killed in 1944, which is actually during his own lifetime. So he was only, obviously, 3 years old, maybe even 2 years old, but during his lifetime, these atrocities happened. So he has this further quote when he was there: Europe and the world must be united to defeat whoever wants to drag us into a new age of terror. So it's great to see that the leader comes into power at 79 years old and comes in with fire and really wants to address the real world issues, namely nationalism and those crimes that existed even with his own lifetime. In 2016, the Prime Minister created a constitutional referendum where they wanted to reform the composition of powers in Italy, but 60% voted down. The reason I say this, obviously, they failed, but it's important to see that Italy is and was going through turmoil at this time, and Mattarella maintained to hold on to the reins and hold on to the bull and managed to handle it well. And I think it's because he deals really well under stress. He's seen crazy things. He's seen his brother killed, but that's wild. In 2018, during the general elections, there was a conflict with Matteo Salvini and the Five Sitar movement, which was a league just trying to get control of the government, essentially. He refused Paulo Savona as finance minister because he found out 2 Eurosceptics. So here's where we start to see a bit of his political philosophy. He is pro-Europe, and the guy was also anti-German, which is Eurosceptic is almost a bit synonymous with being anti-German. So I don't think by Mattarella what he means here is that it's not that he's favoring Nazism or anything like that. It's that Europe right now, and Angela Merkel is sort of the most powerful nation in the EU, and he needs to have leaders in his own government who support that ideal. So the Five Star movement called to impeach Mattarella, but he managed to maintain in power and he came up on top. But this conflict is still continuing to this day. But nonetheless, in terms of his political life, I think while he has not been in the role for too long, I think he's done some very good things, particularly that which he did in Sicily, cleaning up the mafia, and his approach to the European Union is one of internationalism versus nationalism, and I think that's exactly the kind of leader we need. If only he entered into politics earlier, but maybe it's better to enter into politics earlier to learn more. But in terms of his personal life, as I mentioned, wife Marisa GSS, actually died in 2012, unfortunately, after 46 years of marriage. So this was actually even before he became president of Italy, so that's unfortunate that she never got to see. She died the year after he became a judge at the Constitutional Court, so obviously she was very proud of him. She loved him even when he was a professor, but it would have been nice if she could have seen him become president. His other brother is a managing director at Goldman Sachs, so his other brother went in a completely different direction, investment banking, similar to what Macron did temporarily, or was managing director from 2005 to 2017. I think he's actually retired now. and he has a daughter named Laura who acts as currently as de facto leader. So because Marissa is dead, unfortunately, his daughter is the first lady in Italy, which is nice. He takes her out, and I think yeah. So yeah, go through start with the statistics first, and then move around. In terms of the population, 60.36 million, so a little bit smaller than France, like 6 million, but almost twice the size of Canada, California, or Tokyo. GDP slightly smaller, or well, I say slightly smaller, but it's over the $2 trillion. It's 2.084 trillion. France is 2.778 trillion. So France has almost $700 billion more, but these are all just big numbers anyways. Area is actually about half the size of France at 301,337 kilometers squared, and capital, as you might have guessed, is Rome. The quotes that we did not cover: choosing restoration instead of revolution because Berlusconi represents the past. Just showing that even though he's in like an older age, he still is a forward thinker, and those opponents of his who are backwards thinking is he considers to be a criticism. In all these years, I've tried to emphasize and to promote the need to combat the mafia because it is a cancer which is oppressive and which stifles everybody's freedom. So obviously, I think that this individual's understanding of the mafia is probably deeper than almost anyone could imagine, besides the people who are actually in the mafia themselves. And I think, obviously, it's glorified. Everyone loves watching the movie The Godfather, and it all sounds fun, but they do represent a bad force. I had no intention of entering politics, but then the force of events led me to become involved in politics. So that's the story. That's the story of his life, and I'll talk about that more in the comparison. Quickly, the symbols. Top right is the symbol of Palermo. Here's the symbol of the patron saint of the school that he went to, San Leone. And here's the symbol of Sapienza University. Here's the symbol of the Christian Democrat Party, Democrazia Cristiana. And here's the symbol of the Constitutional Court of Italy. So I'll just repeat this quote one more time before entering the comparison. So I had no intention of entering politics, but then the force of events led me to become involved in politics. So I think that's completely the opposite of Macron, because I think Macron was pushing for politics from day one. So like, I'll misquote it, but some are born great, some find greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. I think Mattarella is more one who had greatness thrust upon him, and Macron is one more who maybe you could say born great, or at least finds greatness, and they both did it in different ways, and they're completely different perspectives and completely different. And the point is that maybe you don't think you'll be a world leader today, but that could change. Some radical change could happen in your life, and it could happen to you, or maybe you want it today, and perhaps it might not even happen. So in terms of the comparison, firstly, I want to point out the age difference. Macron was the youngest president of France in its history. Napoleon doesn't count because Napoleon was an emperor of France, whereas Sergio Mattarella is quite an older leader. In terms of their stance on Europe, they both support Europe, and both are quite vehemently against the Eurosceptics, which I think is good. I think all unions are good, and all unions should get stronger, and that just slowly brings us to perpetual peace. That's my philosophy. They both are quite romantic, I believe. They both, Macron fell in love with, they both, I think, in some ways took some kind of forbidden love, marrying the daughter of your boss, the dean of your university while you're a professor, and marrying a woman who's 24 years older. That's really forbidden love, but I think that's very romantic. They're both quite academic. They both produce research papers, and I think therefore it leads quite a lot of prudence in their actual policies, and the Constitutional Court as well. But in terms of their upbringing, I think though that Sergio Mattarella had a bit more birthright advantage. His father was the founder, or co-founder of the Christian Democrat Party, whereas Macron came from outside the political sphere, quite outside of the capital. But both of them went to university in the capital for, to get more involved. But I think that Macron might have had a bit more of an uphill battle in terms of that. So going back to where I said, greatness thrust upon them, maybe Sergio was more born great, and Macron had to, fight for more. So it's nuanced, and I don't think we can say one is better than the other, but it just needs to be pointed out. I get this from Plutarch's Parallel Lives. I don't know if you've heard me mention it. He takes two leaders and compares them, and sometimes you get into really nitty-gritty stuff that you don't really want to hear, but it must be noted. So yeah, one had a political father, one's father was a physician and also mother in healthcare. They both have divorced parents. I think that's important to note. I think it might have made them a bit more independent. Both had a brother who had died. Macron's older brother was a stillborn. Sergio Mattarella's older brother was killed by the mafia. So both of them, I think both of them feel an innate duty to their older brother. Maybe one is stronger than the other, it's hard to say, but they both have this, I think, looming image of their brother that they want to give justice to. And last one, Macron is a little bit more business-oriented based on his career in investment banking. Mattarella is a bit more legal-oriented based on his career as a judge. So that's the very last nitty-gritty one. So I hope you enjoyed this video. One last time, the quote, "Be yourself, everyone else is taken." And yeah, thank you so much. I hope you continue to support. That's Emmanuel Macron and Sergio Mattarella.